WVW Broadcast Network and The New American are pleased to present The New American TV with your host, Rebecca Terrell. This broadcast is committed to helping you understand the truth behind the news. And now, here's your host, Rebecca Terrell.
Welcome to The New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today is Thursday, February 23rd, and here are some of the headlines we're following. China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, traveled to Moscow this week. Beijing appears to be ramping up its diplomatic effort to push for a peaceful settlement in Ukraine. Yi met with Russian security chief Nikolai Patrushev. This was just hours after Putin announced Russia was suspending its participation in the New START nuclear arms treaty with the U.S. That agreement limits American and Russian nuclear development. Yi's arrival coincided with Biden's trip to Ukraine. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is also preparing to visit Moscow for a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the coming months. Xi's meeting with Putin will be part of a push for multi-party talks on peace in Ukraine and will allow China to reiterate its calls that nuclear weapons not be used. Preparations for the trip are at an early stage, and the timing has not been finalized. Xi could visit in April or in early May, when Russia celebrates its World War II victory over Germany. In other news, the Daily Mail is reporting that the U.S. is now blanketed in the synthetic opioid fentanyl. The company that processes drug tests has detected a 9-fold rise in fentanyl use in the Western U.S. these past 3 years. Eric Dawson, the vice president of clinical affairs at Millennium Health, said his researchers had seen a 146% increase in the number of positive fentanyl tests nationwide between 2019 and last year. The biggest rises were seen along the Pacific coast and mountain regions, which respectively saw 900% and 875% increases in detections of the powerful synthetic opioid. The European Central Bank met yesterday in Finland to discuss a possible European digital currency. Governors of the national central banks of the 10 euro area countries attended, as did the 6-member European Central Bank Board. Politico claims to have learned that the meeting was in part about this creation of a centralized digital euro and how to get the general European public to accept its implementation. The New American magazine has been warning about central bank digital currencies for years. The deep state and its Great Reset want to make currency digital in order to track every dollar you earn, save, and spend, or to pull the plug on your earning, saving, and spending if you don't toe the party line. Senior editor Alex Newman recently broadcast a video at thenewamerican.com called Central Bank Digital Currencies, a Recipe for Global Slavery. Let's take a look.
Now, the filmmaker Aaron Russo, who actually was a good friend of a key member of the Rockefeller dynasty before he passed away, said that eventually the goal was to get all the money on chips. I want to show you this little clip.
The whole agenda is to create a one world government where everybody has an RFID chip implanted in them. All money is to be in those chips, right? There'll be no more cash. And this is giving me straight from Rockefeller himself. This is what they want to accomplish. And all money will be in your chips. And so instead of having cash, anytime you have money in your chip, they can take out whatever they want to take out whenever they want to. If they say you owe us this much money in taxes, they just deduct it out of your chip digitally.
Total control.
Total control. And if you're like me or you, and you're protesting what they're doing, they can just turn off your chip. And you have nothing. You can't buy food. You can't do anything. It's total control of the people.
Joining me now to discuss these developments is the New American commentator, Daniel Natal. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rebecca. Yeah, I mean, these stories are kind of intertwined with each other. Like as Alex Newman noted, that central bank digital currencies are a way to control individuals, but they're also a way to control nations. And what's happening right now, there was a chill thrown over the international economic community when the United States shut off Russia's money. Their ability to, kind of exchange their treasuries for, U.S. dollars. And so as part of the sanctions deal, Russia was basically bullied by the United States in that way. And every other country on the planet was suddenly, they suddenly realized that they could be controlled and manipulated by these means. And so right now, Russia and China are trying to develop an alternate economic system called the BRICS system, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they're working, there's a guy named Sergei Glaziev, and he's working on a gold-backed or raw materials-backed unit of currency for Eurasia. And so right now, this central bank digital currency thing that the EU is trying to do, it's basically an admission that the current economic system is starting to fray and fall apart. And there are a lot of crazies in Washington. Reagan called the neocons the crazies, and he banished them for 20 years because they were agitating for nuclear war back in the 80s. And so these people are now in power, and they see that war checks all the boxes for resetting the economic system, for kind of creating the circumstances of a post-World War II period where the rest of the world was blown up. And so the United States had an ascendancy artificially, and they want to recreate those circumstances. So we're in very dangerous territory right now.
How do we get out of it, do you think?
Basically, the only way, there's two ways out of it. If the citizenry kind of goes to their legislature and their respective legislatures, and they kind of lobby and make their politicians aware of what's happening, or secondly, and this is probably what's most likely to happen, is that we don't have enough raw materials for all of these, for this prison planet. The CCTV society, mass surveillance, warrantless surveillance, requires lithium and cobalt and iron and tin and silver. Right now, Russia is kind of cornering the silver market. So a lot of these electronic surveillance, things that Washington would want to implement are being kind of hobbled by other countries that are quite aware of what's happening, and they're trying to fight it. So that may actually be, a saving grace, is the limitation of raw materials on planet Earth. So,
well, speaking of raw materials and things that we have a scarcity of, just when you thought your utility bills were crushing you financially, Vice President Kamala Harris swoops in to set the record straight. In a Wednesday speech in Maryland, she claims that the Biden administration has lowered electricity and heating bills.
Every day, Joe Biden and I talk about and work together with our partners, like former leader Hoyer, current leader Hoyer, to lower the cost for the people of our nation, because you are a leader. For working families, we have reduced heating and electricity bills, so folks have more money in their pocket to buy things like school supplies, replace the dishwasher, or take a family vacation.
Despite the claims of Madam Vice President, the latest Consumer Price Index records an 11.9% increase in electricity prices and a 26.7% spike in gas prices over the 12-month period ending this January. Fuel oil is up 27.7%. But while we're in the realm of the bizarre, meet Emily Kohrs, the foreman of the Georgia grand jury investigating Donald Trump over so-called election subversion.
Did you personally want to hear from the former president?
I wanted to hear from the former president, but honestly, I kind of wanted to subpoena the former president because I got to swear everybody in. And so I thought it'd be really cool to get 60 seconds with President Trump of me looking at him and being like, do you solemnly swear? And me getting to swear him in. I kind of just thought that would be an awesome moment.
How many people came into the room to testify with immunity deals already in place?
Maybe a dozen. My coolest moment was shaking Rudy Giuliani's hand. That was really cool for me. I made a point of stopping them and being like, wait, before we go back to this, can I shake your hand? Because it's an honor to meet the guy. It was really neat for me.
That is from an NBC News interview. Amidst giggles, Kohrs indicated that the grand jury recommended indicting more than a dozen people. Though she refused to name names, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution got more details out of her by noting that Trump recently tweeted his thanks to the grand jury for its total exoneration of him. Kohrs responded by rolling her eyes and then bursting into laughter. Did he really say that? She asked. Oh, that's fantastic. That's phenomenal. I love that. Daniel, what is your take on this? Is a grand jury foreman. I'm not sure that we haven't really entered the twilight zone, to tell you the truth.
Well, they're finding more and more videos from this individual as well as on Etsy, I believe, somebody outed like all of her magical spells, where she was, kind of, sharing her witchcraft guidelines with people. So yeah, I mean, this is, kind of a weakness of our system, where it's supposed to be a jury of your peers. And so they're supposed to, with the voir dire process, they're supposed to try to weed out eccentrics and people who are, possibly mentally unstable. And this was an example of a failure of the judicial process in Georgia, which we're seeing a lot more of with George Soros type, district attorneys and the infiltration of the legal system. The Ford Foundation, by the way, just to hit this really quickly, back in the 70s, they also set out essentially to subvert our legal system and to, disempower it and remove constitutionalists and put in globalists. And this is the result. This is kind of like the equivalent of the defund the police, activism that led to this spike in crime rates. So we're watching kind of the erosion of our criminal justice system, with people like this getting in. So it's an unfortunate circumstance.
Yeah, well, I wonder what her behavior would have any bearing on any of the defendants' positions.
Yeah, exactly. Like mistrials and stuff like that. I mean, this is perfect fodder for that. So who knows? I have no idea. I've only kind of glanced at this story,
right?
And it just seems like an incredible like dumpster fire. But yeah, we're going to see more and more of this, unfortunately, as we edge forward into the future because of the subversion of our legal system. So
exactly. I see you have your laptop open there. What else are you monitoring for us out there?
Yeah, I am looking. I have my own little stories, and I know I'm kind of tracking different things. And one of the things I made a note for myself regarding you discussing China, the China story with the diplomat coming from Beijing to Russia, ostensibly to try to negotiate like a peace deal, regarding nuclear proliferation. And but just recently, Russia has been signaling that no, China was there to support Russia in its kind of sovereign territorial dispute, and they weren't there to kind of be like a mediator between the East and the West. And so. And we were talking about yesterday China's asymmetrical warfare tactics, and Graham Allison, the Harvard expert on China, talked about that in his book Destined for War. And the very next story you hit was about fentanyl, like flooding the United States 900 times. The fentanyl rate, and oddly on the West Coast where China is, across the Pacific.
And it's right; it's all coming from China.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what they say, that the United States the government itself says that China is the single largest distributor of the precursors for fentanyl, and they ship it down to the Jalisco and Sinaloa cartels in Mexico, and then the Mexican cartels bring it up, and they're flooding the country, much like the Opium Wars, when the British basically forced opium on the Chinese population to subdue them, and the Chinese had outlawed drug use, they had outlawed heroin, and the British basically, in the Treaty of Nanking, like 1824, I think it was, they basically forced the populace. So China sees it as tit for tat, like drugging the populace as a precursor, as asymmetrical warfare. So I mean, that was one of the things that jumped out at me. Another story that I found interesting that I'll get your take on is the New York Times admits mask mandates did nothing, not even the N95 masks. So that to me was a phenomenal admission coming from officialdom, from legacy media, to finally what is your take on that, Rebecca?
Well, I do feel like I come at this from a little bit more of a clinical background because I do have a nursing license. I obviously don't practice anymore, but when it all started happening, when we started seeing the pictures from China, all of those people over there in masks. And I thought, oh, that'll never go in the West. I mean, I laughed at it because from a clinical perspective, you don't walk around in a mask. If masks worked, then all nurses and doctors would always have walked around hospitals wearing masks. They, after you have on just one of these little masks that you buy in a packet in Walgreens, they get, after about 15 minutes, they're counterproductive. That's actually infecting you.
Mm-hmm.
And these are basics. These are not things that you learn in the last year of medical school when you're training to be a brain surgeon. These are things that are the most basic nursing 101 basics about personal protective equipment. Anything, your gloves, you don't reuse gloves. You use gloves only for one application for a short amount of time, and then you throw them away because they're considered contaminated. The mask is even more so because you're breathing into it. And then when you talk about N95, N95 is used for particular applications. For instance, for tuberculosis patients, tuberculosis is truly airborne and it is very contagious. And even if you are wearing an N95 mask incorrectly, it's not protecting you from tuberculosis. When people are sick, you quarantine the sick. You don't quarantine the healthy. We feed off of each other. God made us that way. We help each other boost each other's immune systems by interacting with one another.
I kind of started questioning it when the Austrian president was asked about masks, and he was confronted with studies that said that they really didn't do anything, not even the N95 mask. And he said, well, they're really just a symbol, like a symbol of solidarity. And so Philip Zimbardo, the social scientist, he was talking about that back in the 70s. He said that when you put a mask on someone, you basically dehumanize them. And it's a way to keep people separate. And it's a way to basically manipulate, the population. And that was the actual usage of the masks. It had no medical. So I find it very heartening that the New York Times, of all outlets, is finally admitting what people with common sense, knew.
Well, too little in my book. That's too little, too late. But we are out of time. Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciate all your insights, and we will see everybody after these messages.
Hi, I'm Alan Keyes. I'm the host of IMTV's daily talk show about news and events in America. And I want to say a good word for the New American magazine. Not only because Alex Newman has joined us as somebody who is periodically hosting a show, but because New American magazine represents a alternative media that is willing to tell people the truth. With so much fake news spreading about, and the fact that right now this country's in an existential crisis, we remember who we are and where we come from and what our principles are, or we die. Reading New American magazine can keep you up to the minute on the issues that are challenging us as a people and on which that survival hangs. You can check it out and subscribe at www.thenewamerican.com.
All right, parents, listen up. We've all seen the countless examples of how radical leftists have been destroying American schools. It's no longer just about the terrible math and reading levels. Now, radical left teachers birthed from liberal universities are forcing gender indoctrination in kindergarten. They're teaching lessons on white guilt.
Freedom Project Academy has perfected live online learning over the course of a decade. I get a ton of great feedback about this program, a ton.
They're built on Judeo-Christian values, a classical curriculum. What does that mean? It means they're taught, your children are taught the way that the founding generations of the country. My own son Noah did Freedom Project Academy for several years when he was younger.
The more we tell our friends about these things, the more people will get on board, and I believe that we can be the catalyst to some real change.
We must save the West. Our way of life and our culture is under attack, and because of patriots like you and your project, I have optimism for the future.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Part of the truth that we bring you has to do with a very fundamental right, the right to own private property. And there's a very important book that's coming out next week by Mr. Art Thompson of the John Birch Society called Property Rights as Sacred as the Laws of God. Joining me now from our studio in Appleton, Wisconsin is Mr. Art Thompson. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
It is wonderful to have you again. And you and I touched on this book in a previous interview when you were still writing it, or it wasn't ready for press yet. And now the day has come. It's going to be available next week, I understand.
That's correct. Both in the softbound, which I have in my hand, and a preview copy next week, and a hardbound copy as well.
I want to encourage everyone to get it, but let's talk about it. First of all, I think it's very important, the point that you made before we went on air today about what prompted you to write this book.
Well, what prompted me was my education, or better yet, my lack of education. There's certain things I learned as being a member over the years, which I didn't know, which I felt were very, very important to know. And I just didn't get them in my civics classes in high school or college or anything else. And one of them was property, how important property is to the lives and liberty of people. And our founders really thought so themselves. In fact, the title, Property Rights, as sacred as the laws of God is a quote of John Adams. They felt that private property was just as sacred as anything in the Bible. In fact, if you take a look at the Ten Commandments, you'll find that there are laws against, God's laws against usurpation of private property. Thou shalt not covet, and so on and so forth. And this pertains to individuals, right? But it also pertains to government. Government can't usurp the Ten Commandments any more than an individual can, and particularly when it comes to life, liberty, and property. And so I put together this book over a very short period of time. Once I understood the fundamentals, and that's really what we are talking about in this book, of property rights, it was an easy flow off my pen. Not to brag, it just, once you realize these things, it just kind of comes easy to your thoughts.
Well, and I think that the leftist narrative reinforces what you're saying. They know, too, the importance of private property ownership, because the Great Reset has already declared that by the year, 2030 is it? You will own nothing and you will be happy, which is a lie, of course, but...
Well, that's true. And the thing is that what people don't realize is that if they control the property, they control you. Right. That is really what's going on here. Let me throw a couple of things out at you. For instance, people say that they own property. Well, let's ask a couple of questions in that regard. Let's say you're a renter and you don't pay your rent. What happens to you? You're evicted. Let's say you own that property and you don't pay your taxes. What happens to you? You're evicted. So what's the difference? You really don't own that property in the true sense of the term. The government controls it. It really owns it. You're just paying rent on it for the rest of your life in taxes. And they control what you can do or not do with that property. So that is a huge erosion on the property rights as they originally were in our country when we started. And that has been to control the people. Now, the Great Reset and all of those things coming down by environmentalists is nothing more than to enforce the plank number 1 out of the Communist Manifesto, which is to eliminate all private property, that it'll be in the hands of the state. And that is what is behind the control of the people. If they control all property, they control all individuals. They have no control over anything, whether it's their land, their buildings, their crops, the forests, their automobile. Doesn't matter what it is. If the government controls those things, they control you. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And let's go into what you delve into in the book about the Founding Fathers and how they looked at private property ownership.
Well, they looked upon it as inviolate. And in fact, in one statement by, I think it was Adams or Madison, I don't recall which right off the top of my head right now, they said that if private property rights are not held sacred, anarchy and chaos will ensue. And that's what we see on our streets, is that there is not that respect for private property by the mobs in the streets or many local governments, because they prove that by not protecting those private properties, by allowing arson and chaos and the destruction of buildings and businesses and the looting even. No respect for private property and no enforcement as a result of it by our local police. Not to blame the local police, but to blame their bosses in City Hall or the county seat. And
soft on crime. Soft on crime DAs.
So we have to respect private property. It is the linchpin of liberty, and a lot of people don't realize that. Our rights come from God, ultimately, and part of those rights are private property rights. We are actually violating the laws of God if we don't respect private property. It's that simple, and that chaotic if we don't.
And let's talk about now the forces behind the abrogation of these fundamental rights that are wanting to, I've quoted recently in an article that I wrote, a UN document that was formulated back in the 70s that talked about this very topic and postulated that private property ownership contributes to social injustice because everybody isn't equal. And so let's talk for a moment about what you discovered and what you delve into in the book, the forces behind the abrogation of private property rights.
Well, in a word, it's communism. That's what's behind the abrogation of private property rights. And it's power. Don't think, for instance, that all of this is designed to make everybody equal. That's not what's involved here at all. That is the excuse for controlling private property, but it is a lie. It is the biggest lie of communism. What it is power. And when they put all that power over private property in the hands of the state, Marxists, then they hold power over everybody and everything. And that's really what's behind it. And no matter what you look at, no matter what document you go back and research, that is the essence of the argument, although they may couch it in terms like environmentalism or equality or any such thing. But that's not the case. And also this leads to the fact, and as I explain in the book, is that not all of these people who are rich and moguls oppose communism because they realize what communism really is. It is a system to amass power. And so if they are part of the power structure, they don't care what you call it. They will flourish under it. And so a lot of these very rich individuals support the advancement of communism in order to be part of that power structure.
And what you talk about the power struggle and the wanting to get more and more and more power, there's an implicit denial of the existence of God, of the existence of the soul, of the fact that we are all going to meet our maker one day and have to answer for our. Truly, there in that respect, it links it right back to what you said about property rights being a sacred right, as sacred as the laws of God.
Yes.
It fits right in, and that is the reason we do see. I think we need to start seeing our lives. We are physical and spiritual beings, and everything that we work for toward good is a spiritual good as well as a physical good. The physical feeds the spiritual.
That's right. In fact, I kind of like to quip when a rich and powerful man dies, who's always been a problem for the liberty of the people. I always say, I bet he's surprised.
Oh, that is, and it is. It's something to think about. I know, we're looking right now at poor Jimmy Carter and the 4 years that he spent in the White House, which were very detrimental to our country. And, we certainly pray for him. We want what's best for him now, but, he did such damage to our country.
Well, in fact, he promised before he was elected that he would not put people from the Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign Relations or that type of person into his cabinet. That's what he promised before he was elected. And the day after he was elected, that's what he did with his entire cabinet. He purposely did what he did. He didn't fumble and bumble through.
Right.
It was all by design, just like Biden now. Biden's plan has been put in print since 1992, what he wanted to do. And he's just fulfilling what he promised in various articles and booklets that he wrote.
So very true. We can't call them liars in that respect.
No.
The leftists are true to their words, at least. But, and that's one thing that's wonderful about the John Birch Society and about books like yours that you put out. We don't need to wear the tinfoil hat. We don't have to have the conspiracy theorist label. We're quoting them. We're just bringing out to the populace. This is what they're saying. This is what they're planning on doing. We're running out of time here, actually, and I wanted you to have a chance to tell our viewers how to get a copy of your book.
Well, simply go to jbs.org next week and order the book. I would wait till Wednesday or Thursday just in case. We're going to have a big snowstorm come in, so it might slow things down a day or two here. So I would wait till the end of next week to get it, but just simply go to jbs.org and order it there at Shop JBS.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, and we will see everybody else back on the other side of this break.
The John Birch Society has been working tirelessly since 1958 to preserve freedom, safeguard the Constitution, and restore our God-given rights. We continually educate voters and lead the freedom movement. Join us as we work against a tyrannical one-world government. United as one, we can defeat this conspiracy against a free America. JBS founder Robert Welch said, "Education is our total strategy and truth our only weapon." Join us in restoring this great nation.
Imprisonment, forced labor, permanent separation from my family, perhaps death. I knew what could happen to people who were caught trying to defect, but the watchtowers stood yards away. The possibility of a new life in a different world, one without tyranny, was within sight. The West. I thought of the rewards no longer crushed under the boot of communism. I would work and make money, no longer restrained by the chains of collectivism. I would say what I wanted, without fear of spies and informants nearby. I would be free. The frozen rain and Romanian mud sipped through my gloves and cloths. I fantasized about the fire burning in the wood stove of my parents' home, but I pushed those thoughts from my mind, closed my eyes, and waited for the cover of the darkness.
Get Defector, a true story of tyranny, liberty, and purpose by Mark Hobafkovich with Paul Dragu, a thrilling page-turner that will remind you how precious yet vulnerable freedom is. Available at shopjbs.org or Amazon. For a limited time, get 20% off your entire order using promo code Defector20 when you purchase Defector at shopjbs.org.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. Today, joining me from our studios in Appleton, Wisconsin, are two researchers with the John Birch Society to report on some very important legislation that's coming out of Texas and Tennessee. Christian and Peter, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us on again. Thanks.
Absolutely. Christian Gomez is the research project manager for JBS, and Peter Rakowski is a research associate. And you had some exciting news to tell me about before we went on air today about some legislation in Texas and Tennessee. Take it away.
Yeah, we have some really strong bills that we're watching in both of those states, Texas and Tennessee, that will create formal processes for nullifying any type of unconstitutional federal action. So in Texas, that bill is called the Texas Sovereignty Act. It's numbered HB 384 and SB 313. And as mentioned, it would create a comprehensive, very robust process for nullifying any type of federal unconstitutional action, including federal laws, executive orders, executive branch regulations, court rulings, and even treaties. So the bill would do this by creating a joint legislative committee on constitutional enforcement. And what this committee would do is systematically review any type of federal action, laws, treaties, court rulings, etc., whether they were enacted in the past, even many decades ago, current ones that are coming out, or even future ones that could come in the coming months or years. And this committee would be reviewing all those actions and then comparing that to the U.S. Constitution. The bill is very specific. It says any federal law, action, etc., needs to be evaluated based off of the original and plain meaning of the U.S. Constitution. And based on that criteria, the committee would come up with a recommendation. Is this federal action constitutional or is it unconstitutional? And if it's unconstitutional, the committee would recommend that Texas nullify this regulation. And then after that, the state legislator would take a vote on whether to accept the committee's recommendation. If the state legislator votes in favor of accepting the recommendation, Texas would nullify that federal action. So no state or local government entity, regardless of whether it's a state agency or a local government, a city or a county, none of those would be allowed to enforce or take any action upholding that federal action. So it would be a really strong bill towards nullifying any unconstitutional actions and enforcing the U.S. Constitution. And not only does the bill do this, but it also requires any state court to rely on the plain meaning of the U.S. Constitution as the U.S. Founding Fathers intended it to mean when they rule in any constitutional law case, which would be a big step away what courts today often do, which is rely on case law, which in many cases is not based at all on the U.S. Constitution. So it would require the courts also to go back to the U.S. Constitution as well.
Yeah, part of the criteria for the Texas bill includes looking at statements from the first U.S. Congress and also the writings from those who were present at the 1787 Convention at Philadelphia. Because, of course, people could debate the plain meaning. Someone could say something like the General Welfare Clause, taking it out of context, as we've seen for the past 2+ centuries of American history, or the Commerce Clause. So they have to interpret the Constitution based on the original intent, and they can use the writings of the era to support the claim whether something is constitutional or not constitutional.
Isn't this great? This is a wonderful development. Who is it in Texas who introduced this? I noticed there's a House bill and a Senate bill, so we have support on both sides of the legislature there, right?
Yeah, in the House, HB 384 is sponsored by Cecil Bell, and in the Senate, it's sponsored by Senator Bob Hall.
Do you know of specific work that this sounds like a John Birch bill? It sounds like something right out after our own hearts. Did Birchers help bring these bills about?
I actually don't know the exact origins of the bill, but it's certainly definitely something that we at the John Birch Society support. And in other states, we actually have had members trying to introduce and pass these bills. So, for example, in South Carolina, our field coordinator there and our members there actually convinced some legislators to introduce a similar bill as in Texas. And they're currently working to convince the legislator to pass this bill. So Birchers around the country are supporting similar bills like this and working in their state legislators to pass it.
Yes.
So we want to encourage our viewers to visit jbs.org, and they can access copies of these bills and then bring them to their own state legislators and encourage them to do the same in their own states. Now, it is a little bit of redundancy for these to have to be passed in the states because our own federal constitution guarantees the process of nullification, even for our county sheriff to be able to do, right? But we need these bills because people are ignoring that Article 6 of the Constitution, correct?
Absolutely, and for those that are watching and don't recognize what Article 6 of the Constitution is, Article 6 of the Constitution states that only the laws that are passed, that only the Constitution and the laws that are passed in accordance to the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. In other words, if a law is passed that's not in accordance to the plain meaning and text of the U.S. Constitution, then it's not the law of the land. And also Article 6 requires all members of government at all levels to take an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. So anyone elected to local office, state office, even federal office is duty-bound to only enforce actions that are within the boundaries of the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
Yes.
Now, were these bills, now you both also mentioned a bill in Tennessee that's very important. Let's cover that real quickly.
Yeah, there's a similar bill in Tennessee called the Restoring State Sovereignty Through Nullification Act, House Bill 726 and Senate Bill 1092. And it's similar in that it would also create a formal process for nullifying any type of unconstitutional federal action, including laws, executive orders, court rulings, treaties, etc. It's slightly different in the sense that it creates 5 separate processes for the governor, the General Assembly, state courts. It creates a process for allowing municipalities and counties to essentially force the General Assembly to pass a nullification bill. It creates a process for citizens to force the General Assembly to pass a nullification bill. But it's similar in the sense that it, once again, creates processes for doing that. And as you mentioned, it's not necessary for a state to pass such a bill because the U.S. Constitution already has such a process. But these bills are a really great way of educating both the legislators and also the general public about nullification, showing them, this is something that we can do, and this is something that we have a duty to do. So such a bill will be a really huge step towards pushing back against the federal government's many usurpations.
Yeah, right. Well, we learned from COVID that nobody's paying attention to nullification, right? Please go ahead, Christian.
I was just going to say, in the state of Tennessee, you could thank Representative Bud Halsey and also Senator Janice Bowling for introducing these in the House and Senate. So I would urge all of you who live in Tennessee, such as yourself, to contact your legislators and ask them to co-sponsor the bill introduced by Bud Halsey and Senator Janice Bowling to restore the sovereignty of the state of Tennessee. In fact, these bills are excellent answers to the question, if you don't want to do an Article 5 constitutional convention or convention of states, as some call it, then what do you do? Well, this is an excellent example of how the states can truly rein in the federal government, because a large reason why the federal government is so out of control is in part because the states go along with it. The states acquiesce to the demands of the federal government. They take the federal funds. They implement these unconstitutional federal programs. So these two bills, the one in Tennessee and the one in Texas, also the one in South Carolina and other ones that are being drafted as we speak, create a process for the states to say no to the federal government. We're not going to go along with your unconstitutional big government spending spree and infringement on the rights of our citizens and the sovereignty of our states. So this is something that states can tangibly do to stand up to the federal government right now, and they'll have to wait for a bunch of states to act together to maybe hopefully get something that might restrain it, but we're not sure.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a couple more minutes here. Gentlemen, please let our viewers know how to get a hold of these bills and a hold of their congressmen to support them.
Yeah, anyone can do that by going to jbs.org/alerts. And there we have all these alerts for Tennessee, for Texas, and for other states. And people can easily go to those alerts and easily use those to contact their state legislators and tell them to support these bills. And also, there are other states that either have introduced similar bills or that will introduce these bills. So we mentioned South Carolina just a few minutes ago. There are some other states that we think will be introducing similar bills in the near future. So we'll be keeping everyone updated on these bills as they're introduced and as they move through the legislative process. But anyone can use those and contact their legislators by going to jbs.org/alerts.
Okay, and also on that website, you can sign up to receive alerts in your email inbox and be kept up to date, not only on federal level, but specific alerts designed for your particular state. So yeah, we definitely encourage people to visit jbs.org. Also follow us at thenewamerican.com, and you can click on Freedom Index at thenewamerican.com and find out how your legislators are voting on matters like this of great importance to our country. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for the information that you've brought us today. These are things that we can't learn about from the major media. They'd rather just cover it up and hide all this progress that we're making. So we appreciate you being with us, and everyone, we will see you back after these messages.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
Just imagine if we have a constitutional convention, the number of people who will be unhappy and the number of people who say the results are not valid, and then they'll just ignore the entire Constitution.
What we need are just more people that would read the one we have.
It isn't the Constitution that's the problem. It is the people who ignore the Constitution that usurp power and abuse the constitutional power that they ostensibly have.
If you can't enforce an existing piece of paper, how are you going to enforce a piece of paper that has a little more writing to it? In other words, it's been amended.
It's up to us to hold our elected officials accountable.
What can you do to elect good representatives and senators in your state legislature who understand the Constitution and are willing to take a stand?
life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence proclaims God-given rights, and we intend to protect them. Working with people like you for over 50 years, preserving freedom and building a better tomorrow. Safeguarding the Constitution by limiting government power. We are restoring liberties, educating voters, and leading the freedom movement. Join with us. United, we will defend our rights. We are all Americans. We are the John Birch Society.
Welcome back to the New American TV, where we bring you the truth behind the news. And we also want to dedicate a portion of this program every week to bringing us all back to basics. If we don't have a good foundation, we're not going to know how to rescue our country from the enemies that are after it, foreign and domestic. And with me today, joining me from our studio in Appleton, Wisconsin, is Executive Senior Editor of the New American Magazine, Mr. Steve Bonta. Steve, welcome to the program.
Hi, Rebecca.
And you and I had talked before we went on air today. You said that your topic today was going to deal with the topic of what is the natural law and does it actually exist?
Well, I had a view to sort of, as we present these topics, these principles on a weekly basis, to have sort of each one flow naturally out of the previous one. So last week, you recall, we talked about the reality of God and some of the attributes of God, all right? And so, you know, the thing that I want to talk about today, that sort of the most important principle, or the first principle that arises from the notion of God, is that there is a notion of God's law, or natural law, or law of nature. So those terms were more or less interchangeable a couple hundred years ago. And it's worth talking about because this idea of law has been greatly confused and confounded by a certain weakness in the English language, and that is that we have only one word for law that we generally use, which is law. Okay. Now, the Latin language, which is the language in which all of our sort of legal and philosophical discourse is grounded, had two words which could both be translated for law. And this is relevant. The first was jus, which is ultimately the origin of words like jurisprudence and justice and so forth. And that word corresponded to more or less what we're talking about today, which is this idea of law in the abstract, something that is not necessarily written by human hands, but maybe laws of nature and laws of ethics and morality and so forth and so on, not to mention God's law. And so generally people who used to write in Latin as the language of scholarship referred to things like jus naturae, the law of nature, or jus gentium, the law of nations, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. The other word for law in Latin is lex. And that's the origin of words like legal and legislate. And that had reference specifically to man-made law. And there was some overlap in meaning between those two words, jus and lex, but in general, that's what lex meant. Lex would mean a specific, man-made law or decree or code or something like that. So it was sometimes considered as maybe a subset of jus, but jus was it was the general principled word. And jus also means right, in the sense of human rights and that kind of thing, God-given rights. So it's really a nice word, and it's a shame that the English language has lost that distinction, because it's led to this great confusion in the minds of moderns, particularly legal scholars and so forth, as to exactly what law is or should be. So on the one hand, you have fuddy-duddies like myself who espouse the view, the old-fashioned idea, that, and I would say that also the view of the founding fathers and pretty much every theologian who's ever lived and so forth and so on, that above and beyond all man-made laws and all man-made statutes are the laws of God, which would include natural laws pertaining to physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. The laws that allow the physical universe and the organic universe to exist and perpetuate itself, that impose order and this kind of thing. And then also there are laws also emanating from God that govern human behavior, for which the violation, will lead to consequences, punishments, and so forth and so on. So things like the Ten Commandments, and of course the common law of England, the great common law tradition that we are blessed inheritors of, was grounded in the idea that really the basic fundamental moral laws don't arise in the first instance from some emperor like Justinian or some codifier of law. They come from God. They come from a superhuman source, and at best, man-made laws are sort of a pallid reflection of those and an attempt to codify or to keep our legal code, our written legal code in consonance with these eternal laws. And then there's the other point of view, which is often called positivism, and that point of view is sort of like the atheism of the legal world. It's the idea that there is no such thing as natural law or God's law, that law is purely materialistic, and that the only intelligible way of thinking about law is in terms of the stuff that governments and men and legislators create. So from that point of view, of course, there's also not going to be any ultimate right and wrong, but only relative right and wrong determined by situational ethics and so forth and so on. Okay?
Right. So that would reduce us basically to the status of animals that cannot think beyond our stomachs, so to speak.
Well, perhaps, certainly it would, well, or one could say it would elevate us to the status of gods, making our own laws, bound only by what we personally determine individually or collectively as a society to be right and wrong. And this is pretty much the perspective that many, many people have about law today. And it is emphatically not where the American founders came from and the men who came before them. I'll give you a little bit of history that's kind of forgotten today. So this idea of natural law has very deep roots, obviously. It originated with people like Aristotle and so forth and was carried forward by some of the great theologians of medieval Christendom. Constantine, for example, and Aquinas and many others thought about this. And so then starting in the 1600s in the Dutch Republic, there was a man, his name was Grotius. At least that's the usual name, Hugo Grotius. And you know, that wasn't his birth name. His birth name was actually Groot, kind of like that tree superhero dude in the Marvel comics, except he did know how to say more than I am Groot. Those were probably his first words. But then after that, he said ego sum Grotius, and he changed his name to Latin. I think that's what people did in those days, is they Latinized their name. If you were somebody, you got to change your name to Latin. And Grotius, as is known today, is kind of considered to be the father of what he would have called the theory of natural law and the law of nations. Nowadays, it's often referred to as international law, and there is sort of a difference because, again, the idea is that international law is something that can be written and codified by some international authority like the UN. But from the point of view of Grotius, or Groot, de Groot, which means great, by the way, in Dutch, in case you're curious. Anyway, his idea was that nations were bound ultimately, sovereign nations, in the kind of Westphalian sense of the word, were bound only ultimately by the laws of God. That was the jus gentium, the law of nations. And so he was sort of the founder of this great tradition that sought to understand, to in effect apply the laws of God as they were understood within the context of Christianity to what ought to be the proper conduct among nations. Of course, he also said, in effect, that the nations, since there was no higher earthly authority, that it was up to God and God's judgments to punish them if they violated his laws and so forth. But the idea was that was in effect the idea. And then this idea was extended to the rights of individuals and so forth in general. People like John Locke, of course, took for granted that as individuals created by God in God's image, that there were a whole series of rights that inhered in us as a result of the laws of nature and nature's God. In fact, that very phrase is found in the opening stanza of the Declaration of Independence with reference to the justification for writing this declaration and setting the other nations of the world on notice that America now was to be treated as an independent and therefore equal sovereign entity with the other nations. And the exact phrase that Jefferson used was to assume the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them.
Right. And you can you see then from what you're saying, it's very clear what happened throughout history, going back to Grotius. And actually, he was a student of the Jesuit Francisco Suarez, who came up with that idea that, yes, our rights come from God. Governments are instituted to protect those rights. But then it was the revolutionaries of the Enlightenment who came back and said, no, we get our rights from some type of idea of just
from the state,
we're
or from the
man,
collective.
from the state. But ultimately, it was the state, because you can't have a vacuum. If the rights don't come from God, they have to come from somewhere. So they come from the state, which is the lie. And that's what brought about the French Revolution. And that's what's bringing about our own demise as a country right now, if we don't watch out, right?
Well, absolutely. Not only our country, but every country that has fallen to communism or radical socialism, or what we now call wokeism, or whatever ism you want to style it. They all have their roots in this radical belief of positivism that there is no law other than what we ourselves make. Man-made law is it, and beyond that, so you literally can't comprehend the notion of a free republic and of inalienable human rights. I mean, the very word inalienable, which we all should be familiar with, means can't be taken away by whom? By the government. Okay, the government being the highest earthly authority that we normally have to deal with. The idea of inalienable rights and natural law means that there's a higher authority still that has decreed, before the world was made, in effect, that these things called rights exist, predicated on laws that also exist, and we human beings have no business tampering with them. At best, our responsibility as framers of government and as legislators and so forth is to create laws that protect these rights and that mete out punishment only consonant with the sort of thing that would be expected as God's justice. So this is the origin of things like capital punishment and other things. And most of this, if you look in the common law code, there's no law that actually says it's wrong to kill somebody or it's wrong to steal. Those are sort of presumed. Those are assumed, and then the laws that define the different types of homicide and theft and assault and all these other types of things are predicated on the notion that these things are wrong. We shouldn't have to tell you that they're wrong, right? So, I personally think that this idea is, we all deep down inside know that this is true. Because even in, outside of the Western world, you find certain moral values and standards. Even in communist countries that profess to be atheistic, they still, it's sort of assumed that there are certain things that are wrong, that shouldn't be done. And even though people say, well, yes, but it's only because they militate against social order or whatever, which is a common excuse used by communists and socialists. But still, there's more to it than that. They're wrong because they're wrong. And the reason is that there is such a thing as natural God or God's law.
Exactly. And when you kick that out, and when you kick God out, we get what you get what you're asking for. Steve, thank you so much for your insights today. I want to encourage everyone to visit us at thenewamerican.com. You can read a lot of Steve's material there, and we will see everybody back after these messages.